Grace Bennett once believed she had found her forever in Brian. They met when she was still in college, a quiet girl with her head often bowed, shy to speak up, the kind who avoided eye contact because she feared being judged. Brian had pursued her persistently, walking her to class, waiting outside the library, finding excuses to sit with her in the dining hall. When she discovered she was pregnant, she thought, perhaps naively, that fate had finally blessed her. Brian proposed quickly, and she accepted without hesitation. To her, it seemed like the responsible, even romantic, thing to do. In those first weeks after their wedding, Brian behaved like the attentive young man she had known. He told her not to worry, that he would take care of her, that together they would start a life worth remembering. Grace, who came from a modest family in another state, allowed herself to believe him. She had always been the only child, deeply loved and protected by her parents, and she carried that sense of innocence into marriage. She thought she was stepping into a new chapter filled with stability. But the move back to Brian's hometown in Indiana shifted everything. The small town streets that at first seemed quaint soon became isolating. Here, everyone seemed to know everyone else's history, and Grace, the newcomer, quickly learned that her world had shrunk to the walls of Brian's family home and the handful of streets surrounding it. It was in this environment that Brian's mask began to slip. The polite young man who once brought her flowers from the grocery store now disappeared for nights at a time. He would come back smelling of alcohol, his words slurred, his temper quick to ignite. Grace tried to convince herself it was stress, that he would settle down once their child was born. She excused his drinking, telling herself it was only a phase. But night after night, she found herself sitting awake, waiting for the sound of the lock turning, bracing for which version of Brian would stumble in, loud and boisterous or cold and silent. Her parents, hundreds of miles away in Ohio, still called every week. Grace kept her voice steady when she answered, always telling them things were fine. She knew if she told them the truth, that her husband was slipping further into recklessness, that she was often alone and afraid, they would worry themselves sick. They had given her a life of love and stability, and the thought of burdening them with her unhappiness felt unbearable. So she smiled through the phone, reporting only small, harmless details, keeping her loneliness and fear locked tightly inside. Brian's family noticed, of course, but in a way that only deepened her isolation. His mother brushed off any concern. "He's young," she would say with a dismissive wave of her hand. "He just needs time to settle down. Boys will be boys." To her, Grace's exhaustion was a sign of weakness, not the crushing weight of carrying a household on her shoulders. When Brian stumbled in drunk, his mother laughed softly, telling Grace that her own husband had been the same. "At least you know he'll come home eventually," she said, sipping tea at Grace's kitchen table as though it were a casual reassurance. Grace tried to believe it. She tried to believe that once their baby arrived, Brian would change, that fatherhood would sober him, would remind him of responsibility. But as her belly grew, so did the silence between them. Brian avoided her eyes, avoided the conversations she tried to start about their future. The young man who once whispered promises of forever now barely noticed her. And when he did, it was only to mutter complaints about her being tired, or about the meals she managed to put on the table despite her swollen feet and restless nights. The small town houses around her began to feel like walls closing in. She had no friends here, no familiar streets to walk when she needed to clear her head. The people she passed at the grocery store smiled politely but never invited conversation. She was the outsider, the quiet wife of Brian Bennett, the man who everyone in town knew loved his weekends at the bar. Grace's world narrowed to the walls of their modest home, the steady hum of the refrigerator, and the constant hum of her own thoughts telling her that this was not the life she imagined. And yet, she stayed silent. She stayed because she thought she had no choice, because she believed that leaving would break her parents' hearts, and because she still clung to the hope that Brian would come back to her, the version of him she met in college, the one who made her laugh, the one who promised to build a life together. But deep down, in the quiet hours of the night as she lay awake, Grace felt the truth pressing in. This marriage, born of a hurried decision, was cracking around her. She was alone, cut off from the love that had once surrounded her, and tied to a man who no longer cared to hide the darkness she now saw so clearly. The seeds of tragedy had been planted. She did not yet know how far the fall would be, but she could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet, inch by inch, as though warning her that the life she thought she had built was already slipping away. By the time Grace entered her third trimester, Brian's absences had become routine. What once felt like the occasional late night now stretched into entire weekends. He would vanish on a Thursday evening, leaving no explanation, and return sometime Sunday, his eyes bloodshot, his shirt wrinkled, the smell of alcohol clinging to his skin. He didn't bother to hide it anymore. If she asked where he had been, he either brushed her off with a sarcastic laugh or snapped at her to stop nagging. Grace tried to hold on to patience, telling herself it was temporary, that once their child arrived, Brian would realize what mattered. But the man who had once walked beside her with promises of devotion seemed long gone. In his place was someone who treated their marriage like a cage he needed to escape from, someone who saw her more as a servant than a wife. When Lily was born, Grace felt the world shift. Holding her daughter in her arms, she believed, just for a moment, that everything could change. She thought the sight of the tiny girl with a soft tuft of hair and wide eyes would awaken something in Brian, that he would finally understand what it meant to be a father. She had hoped he would cradle the baby, smile with pride, and become the man she once knew. But the reality was brutal. Brian showed little interest in their child. He visited the hospital only once, hungover and restless, checking his watch as if he had somewhere better to be. At home, when Lily cried through the night, it was Grace who woke, Grace who fed her, Grace who paced the small bedroom floor until her arms ached. Brian rolled over in bed, groaning at the noise, muttering for her to keep the kid quiet. As the weeks passed, Grace realized her hopes had been illusions. The arrival of their daughter hadn't softened Brian, it had hardened him. He became sharper with his words, more dismissive with his tone. "What do you even do all day?" he sneered once, glaring at her in the kitchen. "You sit at home while I work. You can't even keep the house clean or make yourself look decent. Just fat from sitting around with the baby." His insults cut deeper than his indifference. Grace, exhausted from sleepless nights and endless feedings, barely recognized the reflection in the mirror. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her once bright face carried only fatigue. She tried to defend herself at first, but Brian twisted every word, throwing it back at her with venom. After a few painful arguments, she learned silence was safer. If she had expected his mother to intervene, she was disappointed. Martha Carter, the neighbor, often lent a kind smile, but Brian's own mother stood firmly by his side. She repeated the same dismissive line every time Grace sought help. "He's young. He'll grow out of it." My husband was the same. "Men just need time." Those words became a shield Brian hid behind. Whenever Grace tried to bring up his behavior, he mocked her. "Even Mom says it's normal. You think you know better than her? She raised me, didn't she?" The weight of his mother's approval made Grace feel smaller, as though her suffering was nothing more than impatience. In the evenings, when Brian did come home, the atmosphere was suffocating. He would sit on the couch, beer in hand, flipping channels while Grace rushed between Lily's crib, the stove, and the sink. If she sat down for a moment, he barked at her to fetch him another drink or accused her of being lazy. Once, when she forgot to buy his preferred brand of whiskey, he erupted, slamming the cabinet door so hard the frame cracked. Lily startled awake, wailing, while Grace froze, clutching her daughter tightly, too afraid to move until his rage burned out. Every insult, every slammed door, every night he didn't come home carved deeper cracks into their marriage. Grace felt herself disappearing, reduced to the role of caretaker and scapegoat. She was no longer a partner, no longer seen as a woman with dreams and dignity. To Brian, she existed to serve, cook his meals, clean his messes, raise their child, and absorb his anger. Her parents continued to call, and Grace continued to lie. "Everything's fine," she whispered into the phone, forcing cheer into her voice. She couldn't bring herself to tell them the truth, that their daughter was trapped in a house where love had dried up, where respect had vanished, where she was treated as little more than a burden. The cycle repeated itself, day after day. Brian vanished, returned drunk, lashed out, then left again. His mother defended him, and Grace endured. She told herself she had to, for Lily's sake. She told herself things might get better. But deep inside, she knew each insult, each careless absence, each cruel laugh was pushing her further into a life she had never imagined. A life that felt less like marriage and more like a prison with no key. When Lily turned 1, Grace knew she could no longer survive in the same cycle of silence. Brian's paycheck, often diminished by bar tabs, wasn't enough to cover bills, groceries, and the needs of their growing child. The fridge was sometimes nearly bare, the power bill stacked on the counter, unopened and threatening. Grace understood that if she wanted a future for herself and for Lily, she had to find a way to earn her own income. So she began applying for jobs. She put on the cleanest blouse she had, printed resumes on borrowed paper at the town library, and sent applications to every office, store, and clinic within driving distance. But interviews were brutal. Hiring managers smiled politely, their eyes flicking toward the section of her resume that showed a gap since graduation. "And who would take care of your baby while you're at work?" they asked. Grace would answer with practiced optimism. Daycare, neighbors, anyone she could trust. Still, the polite smiles usually ended with the same response: "We'll be in touch." The calls never came. Each rejection stung, not only for the lost opportunity, but for the unspoken judgment. A young mother was more trouble than she was worth. Grace would return home deflated, only to face Brian's sneers. "See? No one wants to hire you. Might as well stop pretending." He made her efforts sound foolish, yet she persisted. The weight of providing for Lily gave her strength she didn't know she had. Then, one afternoon, the hospital on the edge of town called her back. They needed someone in environmental services, a custodian to clean patient rooms, hallways, and restrooms. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't what Grace had imagined when she dreamed of her career in college. But it was steady. It paid just enough to cover daycare and still bring home groceries. She said yes without hesitation. The first weeks were grueling. Grace's hands grew raw from bleaching gloves. Her feet ached after long shifts on cold tile floors. Sometimes she worked late nights, scrubbing down the ER after a chaotic evening, her body begging for rest while her mind worried about Lily at home. Yet the hospital was also a place of order and routine. Unlike the chaos of her marriage, she found small comforts in the hum of machines, the predictable ring of the intercom, and the camaraderie of other women in her department. There were 2 older women in particular, Lucy and Valerie, who quickly took Grace under their wing. They treated her not like a burden, but like family. "Don't let the supervisors scare you," Lucy told her on her first week, patting her arm. "They bark, but they don't bite." Valerie, with her constant warm smile, brought homemade cookies to share during breaks, often sneaking extra for Grace to take home to Lily. These women became more than colleagues. They became allies, gentle reminders that kindness still existed in the world. Daycare, though expensive, gave Grace breathing room. Every morning she packed Lily's small bag with snacks and her favorite stuffed bear, dropping her off with a kiss and a whispered promise: "Mommy will be back soon." On days Lily fell ill, Grace panicked at first, worried about missing work and angering her supervisors. That's when Martha Carter stepped in. The older neighbor, who had already shown Grace unexpected kindness, offered without hesitation to watch Lily whenever she was sick. "I raised 3 of my own," she said firmly, taking the toddler in her arms. "One more won't scare me." Grace resisted at first, ashamed to rely so much on others. But Martha insisted, reminding her that no one survived in a small town without leaning on neighbors. And slowly, Grace began to trust. She began to feel less alone. Weeks turned into months, and Grace's world changed in subtle ways. She was still exhausted, working shifts, rushing to daycare, juggling bills, but she also discovered strength. For the first time since her marriage began, she had her own paycheck, her own contribution. When Brian mocked her for wasting time cleaning toilets, she bit her tongue because deep inside she knew the truth. She was keeping them afloat. The hospital, with its long halls and fluorescent lights, became more than just a workplace. It became a sanctuary. Here, she wasn't Brian's wife or his scapegoat. She was simply Grace, tired, determined, and learning to stand on her own feet. Lucy and Valerie laughed with her during breaks, shared advice about raising children, and reminded her she wasn't invisible. At night, after Lily had fallen asleep and the house was quiet except for the steady rhythm of the old refrigerator, Grace allowed herself to imagine something she hadn't in years. Hope. It was fragile, flickering like a candle in the dark, but it was there. Hope that she could carve a life beyond Brian's shadow. Hope that Lily might grow up surrounded not by anger, but by stability. Grace didn't know what the future would hold. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of control returning. Each paycheck, each day she survived another shift, each smile from Lily was proof that she hadn't been completely broken. And in that fragile hope, Grace found just enough light to keep moving forward. It was late on a Friday when the storm finally broke. Grace had just managed to settle Lily into bed, her small chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock on the wall. Grace sat at the table with a cup of lukewarm tea, trying to will herself into calm. But the silence never lasted long on nights when Brian was out. The sound of tires crunching against gravel came first, then the slam of a car door. Grace's chest tightened. She knew before he even stumbled through the door what kind of night it would be. The door banged open, rattling on its hinges, and Brian lurched into the living room, his breath thick with whiskey. His shirt was untucked, his hair damp with sweat, his eyes glazed. "Where's my dinner?" he barked, scanning the kitchen like a predator. Grace stood slowly, careful not to provoke him. "It's late, Brian. I saved a plate in the fridge." "Late?" He laughed harshly, stumbling toward her. "You sit here all day doing nothing, and you can't even keep a hot meal ready for me? Useless." She tried to steady her voice. "Please, you'll wake Lily." But that only enraged him further. His face twisted, and he slammed his fist against the table so hard the tea spilled across the surface. "Don't tell me what to do in my own house." From the bedroom, Lily stirred, then began to cry, soft whimpers that quickly rose to desperate wails. Grace turned instinctively to go to her, but Brian grabbed her arm, yanking her back. His grip was iron, fueled by drunken anger. "You think you can run off every time things don't go your way," he shouted, his words slurred but sharp. "You don't go anywhere until I'm done talking to you." "Brian, you're hurting me," Grace gasped, but the plea only darkened his expression. In a sudden, violent motion, he shoved her against the wall. Pain shot through her shoulder as she hit the plaster. Lily's cries grew louder, piercing, terrified. The sound seemed to feed his rage. "You even turned the kid against me," he roared, his fist curling. And then, before Grace could react, his knuckles drove into her back, sending her sprawling onto the floor. For a split second, the world went silent. Grace felt the sting of tears, the ache in her spine, and above all the rush of realization. If she stayed, this would only get worse. Lily's scream shattered the silence, high-pitched and panicked. Grace's maternal instinct overrode everything else. She scrambled up, clutching her daughter from the crib, holding her tight against her chest. Lily's small arms wrapped around her neck, trembling, her sobs muffled against Grace's shoulder. Brian slumped into a chair, already reaching for another drink, muttering curses under his breath. He didn't even try to stop her as she rushed out the door. The cold night air hit Grace like a slap, but she didn't slow. She ran barefoot across the yard, her only thought to get Lily somewhere safe. The nearest place she knew she could trust was the hospital. By the time she pushed through the glass doors of the ER, her chest was heaving, her hair disheveled, Lily still sobbing in her arms. The nurses at the desk froze, eyes wide, recognizing both the terror on Grace's face and the bruises forming on her skin. Without hesitation, one of them, Valerie, guided her into a small family room just off the main hall. "You're safe here," she whispered, handing Grace a blanket. Lucy appeared moments later with a cup of water and a quiet firmness in her voice. "We've called the police. You don't have to go back tonight." Grace sank into a chair, rocking Lily, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the fear she had been burying for years. When the police arrived, they took notes carefully, their tone professional but compassionate. They asked if she wanted to press charges, if she needed medical attention. Grace shook her head at first, overwhelmed. But one officer gently explained that the report would matter if she ever sought legal protection. "This is your record," he said softly. "It proves what happened. It gives the court something to stand on." They encouraged her to file for a restraining order first thing in the morning, explaining how the court could grant temporary protection quickly. Grace nodded, numb but determined. The words echoed in her head. Protection, court, safety. That night, as Lily finally cried herself to sleep against her chest, Grace sat awake in the dim hospital room. The fluorescent light above hummed softly, a constant reminder that she was no longer in her house of fear. She was in a place of order, of witnesses, of people who believed her. And in that sterile little room, Grace made her decision. No more excuses. No more lies to her parents. No more silence. She would not let Lily grow up in a home where violence was normal, where her father's rage dictated every breath. This was the moment everything shifted. Grace Bennett was done waiting for Brian to change. She would leave him no matter what it took. The weeks after that night blurred together. Grace moved through them on autopilot, clinging to the police report and the quiet encouragement of her coworkers. She followed their advice and went to the courthouse, filing for a temporary restraining order that kept Brian out of the house. For the first time in years, she breathed without fear of a key turning in the lock at midnight. But when the divorce proceedings began, Grace quickly realized how little control she truly had. The process moved at an alarming speed, far faster than she had imagined. Papers were drawn, hearings scheduled, and decisions made with dizzying haste. At first, Grace wondered if this was some kind of mercy, a way to free her quickly. But as the hearings unfolded, the truth became clear. It wasn't about her freedom. It was about her mother-in-law's influence. Brian's mother appeared at every meeting, immaculately dressed, her tone firm but polite as she spoke to attorneys and court clerks as though they were her neighbors. She had friends in the county offices, connections she wasn't shy to use. Grace watched from her chair as conversations happened over her head, as documents were passed from one hand to another while her own voice was barely invited into the discussion. Brian, meanwhile, played his role to perfection. In court, he looked clean-shaven, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit but gave the illusion of respectability. He lowered his head at the right moments, nodded at the judge, spoke in a subdued tone. He talked about being committed to co-parenting, about wanting what's best for Lily. To anyone who didn't know better, he seemed like a man trying to make amends. Grace sat in silence, her stomach tight, as the judge commended both parties for seeking an amicable resolution. She wanted to stand up and shout the truth, that this man had left her bruised, terrified, clutching her daughter in the middle of the night. But she had been warned. Raising her voice would only make her look unstable. So she swallowed her anger, nodded when asked if she understood, and signed wherever the pen was pushed toward her. The custody agreement gave Grace primary physical custody of Lily, but the financial support was meager. The child support number read like a cruel joke, barely enough to cover a week of daycare. Grace knew immediately that Brian and his mother had maneuvered this outcome, that they had arranged things so neatly there was little for her to contest. When it came to dividing property, the manipulation became even clearer. Brian's mother spoke briskly, almost impatiently, about the assets. "There isn't much," she told the judge, her voice carrying a rehearsed resignation. "A modest home, some debts, little else. Grace doesn't want the burden. Let her take the land outside town, the one with the old house. That way she has something in her name, and Brian can keep the house he worked so hard for." Grace blinked in disbelief. The land outside town was nothing more than a crumbling property she had heard mentioned only once or twice. A house so neglected that even Brian's family never bothered with it. She realized with a cold twist in her stomach that this was the plan all along. Push her through the process quickly, keep the real assets, and hand her the one thing no one else wanted. The judge, eager to move the case along, nodded. "That seems reasonable. Mrs. Bennett, do you accept this division?" Grace's throat tightened. She thought of fighting, of demanding fairness. But the faces staring back at her told her what the cost would be. More delays, more hearings, more opportunities for Brian to claw at custody of Lily. She couldn't risk it. All she wanted was to be free, to close this chapter before it swallowed her whole. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I accept." And just like that, it was done. A few signatures, a judge's final words, and the marriage she had once believed would last forever was over. Outside the courthouse, Grace stood clutching Lily's small hand, staring at the official documents that declared her divorced. She felt no triumph, no relief, only exhaustion. She had been given a derelict house on a forgotten piece of land, a token gesture to mask the truth. They had stripped her of everything else. But as the wind picked up and tugged at the papers in her hands, Grace pulled Lily close and forced herself to breathe. She had wanted an escape, and now she had it. The land, the house, however worthless it seemed, was hers. And though it was meant as an insult, as a dismissal, it was also a beginning. Grace didn't know what waited for her on that patch of land. She only knew she would no longer live under Brian's shadow. Whatever the cost, this was her first step into a life she would build on her own terms. The first time Grace drove out to see the property, the road seemed to stretch endlessly into nowhere. Lily sat strapped in her car seat in the back, humming to herself, oblivious to the weight pressing on her mother's chest. When the dirt road finally ended, Grace pulled up to a sagging structure that barely resembled a home. The house leaned slightly, as if weary from decades of neglect. The windows were cracked, some missing glass altogether, covered by warped pieces of plywood. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, and the front porch sagged beneath the weight of its own decay. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving weathered boards gray and splintered. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and damp wood. Grace stepped carefully, her shoes crunching against broken glass. The rooms were empty, stripped bare of furniture, as if someone had taken every scrap of value before abandoning it. A patch of mold darkened one wall where rain had leaked through the roof. In another corner, floorboards had buckled, warped by years of water seeping in. Grace stood in the middle of the main room, holding Lily's hand. Her daughter's wide eyes took in the emptiness, the brokenness. "Is this our house now, Mommy?" she asked softly. Grace knelt, pulling her close. "For now," she whispered, though her heart ached at the words. She had been given a shell, a place meant to humiliate her, not to shelter her. That evening, she carried Lily across the yard to the nearest neighbor's, a modest farmhouse with light spilling warmly from its windows. Martha Carter opened the door before Grace even knocked, as though she had been expecting her. Her husband, George, appeared behind her, his broad frame filling the doorway. "Come in," Martha said firmly, ushering them inside. "You're not spending a night in that place, not with a child." Grace tried to protest, embarrassed to impose, but Martha silenced her with a look that brooked no argument. Within minutes, Lily was curled on their couch with a quilt tucked under her chin, a plate of warm cornbread on the table beside her. Grace felt tears sting her eyes at the simple kindness. The next morning, George walked the property with Grace. He examined the roof, tapping at the weak spots with the handle of his hammer. "The bones are still here," he said thoughtfully. "It'll take work, but it's not impossible." Michael, their son, soon joined them. Tall, broad-shouldered, and quiet, he carried a toolbox without being asked. "We'll start with the roof," he said simply, looking at Grace with steady eyes that made her believe, for the first time, that the house might actually be livable. The days that followed were a blur of motion. Michael climbed ladders to replace broken shingles, while George reinforced the porch supports. Martha and Grace scrubbed the walls with buckets of vinegar water, scrubbing until their arms ached, trying to banish the smell of mold. Windows were patched with plastic until glass could be ordered. Hinges were tightened, locks replaced, and doors rehung. Word spread quickly in the small town. Neighbors appeared at the property with items they no longer needed. A mattress still in decent shape, a battered dresser, a set of mismatched chairs. Lucy from the hospital brought over a second-hand crib, insisting it was safer for Lily than the playpen Grace had been using. Valerie donated curtains she had sewn years ago, cheerful patterns of blue and white that instantly brightened the bleak rooms. Within a week, the house began to transform. It was still old, still rough around the edges, but it no longer felt abandoned. The kitchen now had a table where Grace could serve Lily breakfast. The bedroom had a bed instead of a blanket on the floor. A lamp glowed warmly in the corner, chasing away shadows that once seemed permanent. Grace stood in the doorway one evening, watching Michael and George haul in a refrigerator that groaned and rattled but still hummed to life. Lily clapped her hands, laughing as the light flicked on inside when Michael opened the door. For the first time since the divorce, Grace felt something stir in her chest that wasn't fear or exhaustion. It was gratitude, pure and overwhelming. She had expected to be alone in this new chapter, abandoned with nothing but scraps. Instead, she had been given something Brian and his mother could never understand, a community willing to lift her up, to make sure she and her daughter survived. The house still creaked in the wind, and the rain still found its way through some cracks. But when Grace tucked Lily into bed beneath Martha's donated quilt, listening to the soft hum of the rattling refrigerator, she realized they weren't just surviving anymore. They were beginning to live. By the following spring, the rhythm of Grace's days had begun to change. The house, though still imperfect, now held warmth and routine. The hospital job had kept her afloat through the worst of the divorce, but it was Lucy who quietly encouraged her to look for something steadier, something that wouldn't drain every ounce of her strength. "You've proven yourself here," Lucy said one afternoon during their break. "There's a clinic downtown looking for someone at the front desk. Regular hours. You'd be perfect." Grace hesitated, afraid of taking another leap, but with Martha urging her on, she applied. To her surprise, the clinic hired her almost immediately. The pay wasn't much higher, but the schedule changed everything. No more nights scrubbing ER floors until dawn. Instead, she greeted patients with a clipboard and a smile, answered phones, scheduled appointments. It was still work, still exhausting at times, but it didn't hollow her out the way the hospital shifts had. The new job meant she could drop Lily off at preschool each morning and pick her up herself in the afternoon. The first day she left her daughter in the small brick building with cheerful murals painted on the walls. Grace's heart twisted with nerves. But Lily adjusted quickly, bounding home each day with paint smudges on her cheeks, songs on her lips, and new friends' names tumbling from her mouth. When Lily was too tired for after-school play, she often wandered across the yard to Martha's kitchen, where cookies were always cooling on the counter, or to George's shed, where he tinkered with old tools and never minded a child's endless questions. To Lily, the Carters weren't just neighbors, they were family. She had started calling Martha, Grandma Martha, without anyone teaching her to, and no one had the heart to correct it. Michael's presence became a steady part of their lives as well. He showed up without needing to be asked, fixing leaky faucets, hauling heavy boxes, or mowing the patchy grass that threatened to overtake the yard. Sometimes he lingered after the work was done, drinking sweet tea on the porch while Grace watched Lily chase fireflies in the twilight. Their conversations were simple, about the weather, about the repairs still needed, about the small quirks of life in town, but there was a comfort in them that Grace hadn't felt in years. She noticed the way Michael always bent down to listen when Lily spoke, never brushing her off. He let her help with his projects, handing her safe tools or showing her how to hold a flashlight steady. Lily responded with open trust, clambering onto his knee without hesitation, showing him her drawings, declaring proudly that "Not Mom reads better bedtime stories than anyone." The nickname made Grace laugh the first time she heard it, and though she corrected her daughter gently, the name stuck. For Grace, laughter had become a rare thing, almost foreign. Yet now, in stolen moments, when Michael teased her about the stubborn refrigerator that rattled like an old tractor, or when Martha recounted one of George's absent-minded mistakes, she found herself smiling, even chuckling. At first, the sound startled her, as though she had forgotten she was capable of joy, but little by little, she allowed it back in. Evenings no longer felt like a sentence. Some nights, she and Lily ate dinner at the Carter's table, where conversation flowed easily and no one raised their voice in anger. Other times, Grace cooked in her own small kitchen, and Michael would stop by afterward to fix something, staying long enough to share a slice of pie. The house that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with voices, laughter, the clatter of dishes, the hum of life. Grace often thought back to the courthouse, to the smug look on Brian's face when he thought he had discarded her with nothing but a worthless property. He could never have imagined that within those broken walls, she would find community, stability, and the faint stirrings of happiness. On warm afternoons, Grace would sit on the porch steps with a glass of lemonade, watching Lily play tag with the neighbor kids while Michael leaned against the railing beside her. Sometimes their hands brushed by accident, and a quiet current passed between them. Unspoken, steady, and undeniable. She didn't rush it. She didn't let herself dream too far ahead. But in those moments, she realized she was no longer merely surviving. She was beginning, slowly and carefully, to live again. And with each smile, each laugh that slipped past her lips, Grace reclaimed a piece of herself that she thought Brian had destroyed forever. By the time summer rolled around, the bond between Grace and Michael had deepened into something neither of them could ignore. It wasn't sudden, not a spark that flared and burned out. It was a slow, steady warmth that grew with each shared meal, each evening fixing leaky pipes, each laugh that echoed across the porch. Grace, who had once promised herself she would never trust again, found her defenses softening under the quiet steadiness of a man who asked for nothing but gave everything he could. Michael didn't make grand gestures. He didn't drown her in flowers or scripted lines. Instead, one evening as the sun dipped low over the fields, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small box, and sat beside her on the porch steps. Lily was chasing fireflies, her giggles carrying across the yard. "I don't have fancy words," Michael admitted, his voice rough with honesty. "But I know what I want. I want a family with you. I want to stand beside you and Lily for the rest of my life." He opened the box to reveal a modest gold band, simple but gleaming in the fading light. "Grace, will you marry me?" Her throat tightened, her eyes filling. She hadn't imagined this moment, not after everything she had endured, but here it was, quiet and real. She nodded, unable to speak at first, then whispered, "Yes." Michael slipped the ring onto her finger, and when Lily came running up, Grace lifted her hand to show her. "Not Mom is getting married." Lily squealed, clapping her hands. "Does that mean I get to be the flower girl?" Grace laughed through tears. "Of course it does, sweetheart." The wedding was nothing like the first one Grace had endured. There were no extravagant plans, no stiff suits or forced smiles. Just a civil ceremony at the county courthouse, with a judge who spoke kindly and a handful of people who truly mattered. Grace wore a pale blue dress that Martha had ironed for her that morning, and Michael stood tall in a freshly pressed shirt. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Michael squeezed her hand, and Grace felt something she hadn't in years, safe, chosen, and cherished. Afterward, everyone gathered at the local diner, a small brick building with checkered curtains and the smell of frying bacon lingering in the air. The owner, a friend of the Carters, had closed off a section of the dining room just for them. Plates of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and slices of pie covered the tables. It wasn't fancy, but it was perfect. Lily darted between the booths, showing off her flower crown made of daisies, announcing to anyone who would listen that she now had 4 grandmas. When a puzzled boy at another table shook his head and told her, "You can't have 4, you can only have 2," she planted her hands on her hips. "Yes, I can," she declared proudly. "I have Grandma Martha, Grandma Lucy, Grandma Valerie, and Grandma George's sister. That makes 4. The adults roared with laughter, and even the boy looked odd, muttering something about how lucky she was to get so many candies at Christmas. Grace watched the scene unfold, her heart swelling. The diner buzzed with warmth, neighbors raising glasses, women hugging her tightly. George slapping Michael on the back with pride. It was a far cry from the cold, humiliating gatherings she had endured with Brian's family. Here, there was no judgment, no whispers. Only joy, simple and unrestrained. As the evening wound down, Michael pulled Grace onto the small dance floor the diner staff had cleared by pushing back a few tables. There was no band, just an old jukebox playing a country ballad. He held her close, his hand steady at her back, and whispered, "You're home now." Grace rested her head against his chest, tears stinging her eyes. For so long, home had been a place of fear, a place she longed to escape. But here, surrounded by laughter and love, she realized she had finally found it, not in walls or deeds, but in the people who stood beside her. The wedding wasn't about extravagance or appearances. It was about survival turned into healing, about 2 people finding each other in the wreckage of their pasts and deciding to build something new. And as Lily twirled on the diner floor, her flower crown slipping sideways, Grace let herself laugh freely, the sound unburdened, bright and new. The old house had stood for decades, but by the time autumn came, it was little more than a skeleton of sagging beams and stubborn nails. Grace had made it livable, patching what she could and filling it with secondhand furniture. But everyone knew it wasn't a place where a family could thrive long-term. The roof leaked when storms rolled through. The foundation shifted with every hard rain, and the mold along one wall never completely disappeared, no matter how many times she scrubbed. It was Michael who finally said what no one else dared. "We need to tear it down and start fresh." His voice carried no judgment, only certainty. George nodded beside him, his tool belt already fastened around his waist. "We'll do it piece by piece," he added. "This land deserves better, and so do you." Grace felt her throat tighten. The thought of losing even this fragile shelter scared her, but when she looked at Michael's steady expression and George's determination, she knew they were right. The old house was a relic of her past, a reminder of the cruelty that had nearly broken her. Building something new wasn't just about walls and a roof. It was about reclaiming her life. The project quickly became a community effort. On Saturdays, neighbors arrived with hammers, saws, and strong arms. The clatter of wood being pried loose echoed across the yard, punctuated by bursts of laughter and shouted instructions. Piles of debris grew steadily, and beneath the ruin, the promise of a new foundation began to take shape. Grace stood on the edge of the property, Lily perched on her hip, watching as Michael and George worked side by side. Sweat glistened on their brows, but neither complained. They swung hammers with precision, dismantling the structure that had once been meant as her punishment. With each beam that fell, Grace felt the weight of her past lift a little more. Lily wriggled down and ran toward a group of children from nearby houses. Together, they turned the construction site into an adventure, chasing each other through the grass, collecting nails like treasures, giggling as the older boys showed them how to stack wood into pretend forts. At one point, Lily stopped, her hands on her hips, and announced proudly to the group, "This is my home now." The other children accepted her words without hesitation, as if they already knew it to be true. Grace's chest tightened at the sound. She had long feared Lily would grow up associating home with chaos and fear. But now, hearing her daughter's voice so certain, so happy, Grace realized that memory was being replaced. Evenings became gatherings of their own. After the day's work, Martha would appear with pots of stew, and neighbors lingered around long tables set up in the yard. Children ran barefoot until the fireflies came out, their laughter ringing like bells in the dusk. The old house might have been crumbling, but life around it pulsed with energy, full of possibility. Grace often caught herself pausing in the middle of it all, her hands still, her eyes wide, just taking it in. She had never been part of something like this before, people helping not because they had to, but because they wanted to. She wondered if Brian ever saw what he had thrown away, if he had any idea that the woman he left behind now stood surrounded by more love and respect than he had ever given her. Michael noticed those moments when Grace drifted into silence. He would step close, brushing sawdust from his hands, and rest a palm gently on her shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," he told her once, the words quiet but firm. She believed him. The house came down slowly, every wall and rafter carefully removed until only the bare ground remained. Plans for the new home were modest: a simple frame, sturdy walls, enough space for a small family. But to Grace, it might as well have been a palace. She pictured Lily running through new rooms, laughter echoing against fresh drywall, the scent of clean wood replacing mildew. Yet beneath the joy, there was also a quiet intensity, an unspoken knowledge that something still lingered. Grace could feel it in the way Michael's eyes sometimes lingered on the beams, in the way George inspected the walls with extra care. The land, the house, it held more than decay. It held secrets, the kind whispered about in small towns but never confirmed. Grace didn't know what those secrets were yet, but she could feel the story pressing close, waiting to be uncovered. And as she stood in the cool evening air, Lily's laughter drifting across the yard, she knew that the past wasn't finished with her. Not yet. The final walls of the old house came down slowly, as if reluctant to give up their secrets. Michael swung his hammer with steady rhythm, breaking through plaster and pulling away rotted beams, while George stacked wood into neat piles for disposal. Grace watched from the yard, Lily perched on the porch steps with a drawing pad balanced on her knees, her small hands smudged with crayons. Late one afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in amber light, Michael's hammer struck something that rang differently than wood. He frowned, kneeling to pry at a warped panel near the base of an interior wall. Dust rose in the air, catching in the light as he pulled away chunks of crumbling plaster. Beneath it, hidden in a hollow cavity, was a small metal box, its surface rusted and mottled with age. "Grace," he called quietly, though his voice carried an edge of disbelief. She approached cautiously, brushing dust from her hands on her jeans. Michael tugged the box free and set it on the ground. It was heavy, far heavier than its size suggested. Grace knelt beside him, her breath caught in her chest. "What is it?" Michael pried the corroded latch open with the claw of his hammer. The hinges groaned, resisting, until finally the lid snapped back with a screech. For a moment, silence hung thick in the air. Then the fading light caught something inside, and the box shimmered. Grace gasped. Nestled within layers of old cloth were gold coins, strings of pearls, and jewelry encrusted with gemstones dulled only by time. Rings, brooches, and ornate lockets gleamed beneath years of dust, their weight undeniable. It was a hoard that looked like it belonged in a museum or a vault, not in the ruins of a forgotten farmhouse. George let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. Folks around here always whispered the old place was hiding something. Looks like they were right." Grace's hands trembled as she reached toward the box, but stopped short of touching it. She stared at the glittering pieces, her mind spinning. All this time, she had believed the land was a curse, a cruel trick from her ex-husband's family, a symbol of how little they valued her. Yet here, buried behind rotted boards, was proof that fate had a different plan. Lily peeked over, her wide eyes reflecting the sparkle inside the box. "Is it treasure, Mommy?" she whispered. Grace pulled her close, her voice soft but steady. "Yes, sweetheart. It's treasure." That night, after the tools were put away and the yard had gone quiet, Grace sat on the porch with Michael and George. The box rested on the table between them, its contents catching the glow of a lantern. They talked about what it meant, how long it had been there, who might have hidden it, why no one had claimed it. Theories swirled, but the truth remained a mystery lost to time. What wasn't a mystery was ownership. The land was in Grace's name. The house, broken as it was, had been handed to her as part of the divorce settlement. The treasure inside, by law and by right, belonged to her. Grace couldn't stop the tears that filled her eyes. Not tears of sorrow this time, but of awe. The house meant to humiliate her, to remind her of loss, had instead revealed a gift of unimaginable worth. It was as though the universe itself had conspired to show her that stepping away from pain had opened the door to abundance. In the days that followed, news of the discovery spread quietly through the town. Neighbors offered congratulations, some shaking their heads at the strange twist of fate. Yet no one begrudged her the find. They had seen Grace's journey, had watched her scrape and struggle, had witnessed her stand again after being broken. To them, the treasure felt like justice, not loud or vengeful, but gentle and undeniable. With the newfound resources, plans for the new house shifted. Instead of patching together a modest structure, they could build something lasting. A home with strong walls, wide windows, and enough space for Lily to grow. Grace insisted on keeping it simple, not wanting extravagance, but she allowed herself to dream of a kitchen filled with light, of a porch where laughter could drift on summer nights, of bedrooms where no child would ever fear raised voices. One crisp morning, as builders laid the first beams of the new frame, Grace stood watching with Lily's hand in hers. Michael was beside them, his shirt damp with sweat, sawdust clinging to his hair. Lily squeezed her mother's hand and declared, "This is our forever home." Grace smiled, the truth of it sinking into her bones. For so long, home had been a place of pain and survival. Now it was becoming a place of love, safety, and joy. She thought back to the night she fled with Lily in her arms, to the courtroom where she had signed papers with shaking hands, to the derelict house she had once stood in and despaired. Each step had been a shedding, a painful unraveling of a life she thought she needed. And each step had led her here. The treasure was more than gold and jewels. It was proof that leaving the toxic, no matter how impossible it seemed, was the only way to open the door to something greater. As the walls of her new home rose steadily against the horizon, Grace felt peace settle over her like a blanket. The past no longer defined her. The future was hers to build. And for the first time in years, she didn't just believe in tomorrow, she welcomed it.